Some promises are so quiet that only a faithful heart remembers them. Every morning before the sun rose above the rolling hills of northern Montana, the same German shepherd appeared on the weathered front porch of a modest white farmhouse at the edge of town. He never barked. He never chased passing cars or wandered into neighboring yards. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his powerful black and tan frame outlined against the pale blue light of dawn, his amber eyes fixed on the narrow country road disappearing into the pine-covered distance. The townspeople had grown used to the sight over the years. Children riding the school bus waved at him through frosted windows. Mail carriers smiled as they placed letters inside the old wooden mailbox. Elderly neighbors walking their dogs slowed their pace for just a moment, offering quiet greetings that the German shepherd acknowledged only with the slightest movement of his ears. Everyone knew the dog's name was Ranger. Everyone knew he belonged to Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old white former United States Marine who had lived alone ever since returning home years earlier. But no one could explain why Ranger watched that lonely road every single morning with such unwavering patience. Some believed he expected an old friend who had never returned. Others whispered that dogs sometimes remembered things people chose to forget. Daniel himself never answered the questions. Every sunrise, just as the first rays of golden light touched the frost-covered fields, he stepped onto the porch carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. His movements were calm, measured, almost ritualistic. He stood beside Ranger without speaking, his rugged face softened by years of quiet living rather than the discipline that had once defined every step of his military career. Short brown hair peeked from beneath a worn knit cap, light stubble framed his jaw, and a faded pair of marine dog tags rested beneath his heavy flannel jacket, hidden from view but never far from his heart. Ranger never looked at the coffee. He never looked at Daniel. His attention remained fixed on the empty road stretching beyond rows of towering pine trees that swayed gently in the cold morning breeze. The scent of damp earth mixed with fresh pine needles drifted through the crisp air while a thin layer of mist floated across open pastures where deer quietly grazed in the distance. It was a peaceful place where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Yet every morning carried the same strange anticipation, as though both man and dog expected the silence to end. Daniel finally reached down and rested one weathered hand against Ranger's thick neck. "Nothing today," he whispered, his voice carrying neither disappointment nor hope, only acceptance. Ranger blinked once but refused to move. A pickup truck rolled slowly past the farmhouse, its tires crunching softly over loose gravel. The elderly driver lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in greeting before disappearing around the bend. Moments later, a gust of wind swept through the porch, rattling the old wind chime hanging beside the front door. Its gentle notes echoed across the quiet valley before fading into stillness. Ranger stood. Not suddenly. Not alarmed. Simply certain. His ears lifted forward. His tail remained perfectly still. Then, for the first time that morning, he took 3 slow steps toward the end of the porch and stared farther down the empty road than he ever had before. Daniel noticed the change immediately. He followed the direction of Ranger's gaze, but the road remained empty beneath the rising sun. There was no approaching vehicle. No walking stranger. No movement anywhere in the quiet countryside. Yet something unseen had captured the dog's complete attention, and deep inside, Daniel felt a forgotten promise beginning to stir once again. After the morning silence settled once again across the valley, Daniel Brooks carried his empty coffee mug inside the farmhouse while Ranger remained on the porch, watching the distant road as faithfully as he had every day before. The old wooden floor creaked beneath Daniel's boots, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee mixed with pine firewood drifted through the modest home. The cabin was simple, almost untouched by time. A stone fireplace warmed the living room, shelves held a handful of weathered books, and family photographs rested quietly beside a folded American flag displayed with quiet respect. Daniel never needed much. The peaceful rhythm of ordinary days had become enough. Every morning followed nearly the same pattern. He fed Ranger first, placing fresh water beside a sturdy metal bowl before preparing a simple breakfast for himself. Ranger always waited politely until Daniel nodded before eating, a habit formed years earlier that neither of them had ever abandoned. After breakfast, Daniel repaired fences around the small property, stacked split firewood beside the barn, or helped neighbors with jobs that required strong hands but few words. The people in town respected him because he never sought attention. If someone's truck refused to start on a freezing morning, Daniel quietly appeared with jumper cables. If an elderly neighbor struggled to clear snow from a driveway, he arrived before sunrise carrying a shovel. He accepted gratitude with a simple smile before walking home beside Ranger without expecting anything in return. Few people knew much about his years in the Marine Corps because Daniel rarely spoke about them. The only visible reminders rested inside a small wooden cabinet near the fireplace. There, carefully arranged, sat a faded photograph of younger Marines standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a bright desert sky, a neatly folded combat flag, and the worn pair of Marine dog tags he still carried every day beneath his shirt. Ranger often rested nearby during quiet evenings, lifting his head whenever Daniel opened the cabinet before settling comfortably once more. Their silence never felt empty. It felt understood. By late afternoon, golden sunlight stretched across the rolling field surrounding the farmhouse. Ranger finally stepped away from the porch and followed Daniel toward the old red barn where they completed the final chores before sunset. Chickens wandered calmly across the yard while horses grazed beyond weathered wooden fences. A cool autumn breeze carried the scent of drying leaves and fresh hay through the peaceful countryside. Everything appeared exactly as it had the day before, and the day before that. Yet Daniel could not forget the way Ranger had stared farther down the road that morning. The image lingered quietly in his thoughts. That evening, after darkness settled over the valley, Daniel sat alone beside the fireplace reading an old novel while Ranger rested near the front door instead of his usual place by the hearth. Every few minutes the German shepherd lifted his head toward the entrance, listening carefully to sounds too distant for human ears. Outside, the wind moved gently through the towering pines, and somewhere beyond the fields an owl called into the night. Daniel glanced toward Ranger and closed his book. "You hear something?" he asked softly. Ranger did not bark. He simply walked to the front window and stared into the darkness beyond the porch. Daniel joined him, looking out across the moonlit road where silver light reflected off the gravel like a narrow ribbon stretching into the forest. Nothing moved. No headlights appeared. No footsteps echoed through the stillness. Yet Ranger remained perfectly focused, his ears standing tall, his breathing calm, as though he recognized a familiar presence hidden somewhere beyond the reach of human sight. Daniel rested one hand against the cool glass and felt an old memory brushing gently against the edges of his heart, a memory he had spent years trying to leave behind. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale silver fog that drifted lazily across the open fields, softening every fence post and pine tree into quiet silhouettes. Daniel Brooks stepped onto the porch with his usual mug of black coffee before the first rays of sunlight reached the valley. Ranger was already there. He had not waited for Daniel to open the front door. The German shepherd sat in exactly the same place as always, his broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, steady breaths while his amber eyes remained fixed on the narrow gravel road stretching toward the forest. Daniel stood beside him without speaking. Over the years they had learned that some mornings needed words, and others deserved silence. Today belonged to silence. After several minutes, Ranger stood, not with urgency, but with quiet purpose. He stepped off the porch and began walking down the driveway without looking back. Daniel frowned slightly. This was different. Normally the dog stayed close until the morning chores began. Instead, Ranger continued toward the old wooden bridge nearly half a mile from the farmhouse. Daniel set his coffee on the porch railing, slipped on his field jacket, and followed at an easy pace. The cool autumn air carried the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine sap while golden maple trees released a slow shower of crimson and amber leaves that floated gently onto the winding road. Ranger never hurried. His pace remained measured, almost ceremonial, as though he had traveled this exact path countless times before. Daniel suddenly realized that perhaps he had. They crossed open pasture where white-tailed deer lifted their heads before quietly disappearing into the trees. A small creek flowed beneath the weathered wooden bridge, its clear water reflecting patches of blue sky between drifting clouds. Ranger climbed onto the bridge and stopped at the exact center. He sat facing the opposite side, perfectly still, ears forward, eyes resting on an old wooden bench weathered by decades of rain, snow, and summer heat. Daniel joined him slowly. "You always come here, do you not?" he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Ranger remained motionless. Daniel looked around carefully. The bridge overlooked peaceful farmland where nothing seemed unusual. Birds sang from nearby branches. Fallen leaves drifted across the creek below. The entire place carried the comforting stillness of small-town America. Yet something about the bench drew his attention. Its faded green paint had nearly disappeared beneath years of weather. One armrest leaned slightly to one side, and thick moss crept across the wooden legs. Daniel could not remember the last time anyone had actually sat there. As he stepped closer, a cool breeze swept through the valley, carrying another shower of leaves across the bridge. Several leaves slid beneath the old bench before catching against something hidden underneath. A tiny corner of rusted metal reflected the morning sunlight for only a brief moment before disappearing again beneath the leaves. Daniel stopped walking. Ranger slowly rose to his feet but did not approach. Instead, the German shepherd simply watched, calm and patient, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. Daniel knelt beside the bench and carefully brushed away the damp leaves with one gloved hand. Beneath them rested the edge of a small weathered metal box almost completely buried beneath years of dirt and fallen leaves. His heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. There was no fear. Only an unexpected feeling that the quiet road ranger had guarded every morning had finally decided to answer the question neither of them had spoken aloud for years. Daniel wrapped both hands around the small metal box and lifted it carefully from the damp earth beneath the bench. Rust clung to every corner, and the faded green paint had nearly vanished beneath years of rain, snow, and forgotten seasons. It was surprisingly heavy, as though time itself had settled inside. Ranger remained only a few feet away, standing perfectly still with his ears forward, his calm eyes following every movement Daniel made. The German shepherd neither whined nor stepped closer. He simply watched with the quiet certainty that had guided him to this place morning after morning. Daniel brushed away the remaining dirt with the sleeve of his jacket before noticing a tiny brass latch that had somehow survived the passing years. It resisted at first, but with gentle pressure it finally released, producing a soft metallic click that echoed faintly across the peaceful creek. The lid opened slowly. Inside rested several neatly folded envelopes wrapped in faded blue ribbon, protected beneath a sheet of yellowed wax paper that had kept the moisture away. The paper carried the unmistakable scent of old cedar and dust, the kind of smell found only in forgotten attics and family trunks untouched for decades. Daniel carefully lifted the bundle into the morning light. Every envelope remained sealed. Every one bore the same elegant handwriting across the front. They were all addressed to a woman named Eleanor Harper. None carried a postage stamp. None had ever been mailed. Daniel quietly counted them. 12 letters. One for nearly every month of a single forgotten year. Beneath the letters rested a small silver compass, its glass scratched but unbroken, and beside it lay a faded photograph no larger than the palm of his hand. Daniel turned it over carefully. A young Marine smiled beside an old wooden bridge with a cheerful golden retriever sitting proudly at his feet. Standing beside them was a young woman whose bright smile seemed almost untouched by time. The bridge behind them looked remarkably familiar. Daniel slowly raised his eyes and looked around. He was standing in exactly the place where that photograph had been taken many years before. A quiet breeze crossed the creek, lifting the edge of one unopened envelope. Ranger finally stepped forward, lowered his nose toward the photograph, and inhaled deeply before looking beyond the bridge toward the winding road disappearing into the forest. Daniel noticed something unusual. The dog was not searching for a scent. His expression carried recognition. As though he had been here before, long before Daniel had ever chosen this farmhouse as his home. Daniel unfolded the first envelope with extraordinary care, afraid that the fragile paper might crumble between his fingers. The handwriting inside flowed steadily across the page. It was warm, hopeful, and deeply personal. The writer spoke about ordinary mornings, autumn leaves, fresh coffee, and the promise of returning to this bridge one day. There was no bitterness in the words. Only patience. Only love waiting quietly for its chance to come home. Daniel stopped reading after only a few lines. Something about the voice behind the words felt strangely familiar, though he could not explain why. He looked toward Ranger again. The German shepherd had already turned away from the bench and begun walking slowly toward the opposite end of the bridge. Halfway across, Ranger paused and glanced back only once, inviting Daniel to follow. Beyond the bridge, hidden between towering pine trees, a narrow trail disappeared into the woods, a trail Daniel had driven past hundreds of times without ever noticing. This morning, for the very first time, it no longer looked forgotten. It looked as though it had been waiting. Daniel slipped the bundle of letters into his canvas shoulder bag, carefully wrapped the silver compass inside his handkerchief, and followed Ranger beyond the old bridge without hesitation. The narrow trail curved gently beneath towering lodgepole pines whose branches filtered the morning sunlight into soft ribbons of gold that danced across the forest floor. Fallen needles muffled every footstep, leaving only the quiet rhythm of Daniel's boots and the steady movement of Ranger ahead. The German shepherd did not search from side to side like a dog exploring unfamiliar ground. Instead, he walked with calm confidence, choosing each turn without pause, as though an invisible map had always existed inside him. The forest smelled of cedar, damp moss, and cool mountain air, carrying the peaceful stillness that only untouched places seem to hold. Every so often Ranger slowed, lifted his nose into the breeze, then continued forward with the same measured pace. Daniel found himself trusting the dog completely. Nearly 20 minutes later the trail opened into a forgotten meadow where tall grass swayed beneath the autumn wind. At its center stood a small white chapel no larger than a country schoolhouse. Weather had faded the paint, and ivy climbed quietly along one wall, yet someone still cared enough to keep the windows clean and fresh flowers resting beneath the simple wooden cross by the entrance. Daniel stopped. He had lived in the valley for years and had never known this place existed. Ranger climbed the 3 wooden steps without making a sound and sat beside the front door, patiently waiting. Daniel reached for the brass handle and stepped inside. Warm sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, filling the modest room with soft colors that drifted gently across worn wooden pews. The scent of old pine lumber mixed with melting candle wax wrapped around him with unexpected comfort. There was no congregation. No music. Only silence that somehow felt welcoming instead of empty. An elderly woman arranging fresh wildflowers near the altar slowly turned toward the visitors. Her silver hair was gathered neatly beneath a knitted shawl, and deep kindness rested within her gentle eyes. She smiled the moment she noticed Ranger. "Well," she whispered softly, "I wondered if he would finally bring someone." Daniel felt a quiet chill pass through him. "You know my dog?" he asked. The woman nodded without surprise. "He has visited this chapel for many years. Not every day, but often enough that I stopped asking why. He would sit right outside that door for a little while, then leave before anyone else arrived." Daniel looked toward Ranger, who remained calmly seated exactly where she had described. "His name is Ranger," Daniel said. The woman smiled again. "That suits him." Daniel slowly removed the weathered bundle of unopened letters from his bag and placed them gently upon the nearest pew. The woman's expression changed the instant she saw the faded blue ribbon. Her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she stepped closer. She reached toward the top envelope but stopped before touching it, as though afraid the moment might disappear. "Where did you find these?" she asked quietly. Daniel explained the bridge, the old bench, the hidden metal box, and the photograph. The woman closed her eyes for a long moment before opening them once more. "Eleanor Harper," she whispered after reading the name written across the first envelope. "She used to sing here every Sunday." Her voice grew softer still. She never stopped believing someone would come back for those letters. She only hoped it would happen before everyone forgot why they had been written. Ranger slowly stood and walked toward a narrow hallway at the back of the chapel. He paused beneath an old framed photograph hanging on the wall, then looked back at Daniel once again, as though the journey they had begun that morning had only revealed its first secret. Daniel stepped toward the framed photograph hanging in the narrow hallway while Ranger waited beneath it with quiet patience. The wooden frame had darkened with age, but the picture inside remained remarkably clear. It showed the same small chapel many years earlier, filled with smiling families gathered beneath spring flowers and bright stained glass. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across every face, until they stopped on a young Marine standing near the back. His heart skipped gently. The man from the faded photograph inside the metal box was there, dressed in his Marine dress blues, smiling beside the same young woman whose name had been written across every unopened envelope. Eleanor Harper. Beside them stood an elderly pastor and a golden retriever with a white patch across its chest. Daniel glanced down at Ranger. The German shepherd quietly studied the photograph as though recognizing old friends separated only by time. The elderly caretaker walked beside Daniel and folded her hands. "His name was Thomas Harper," she said softly. "He grew up in this valley. Eleanor was his wife. They planned to build a life here after his military service." Daniel listened without interrupting. The woman smiled gently at the memory. "Thomas wrote letters whenever duty took him away. Eleanor answered every one of them. But one autumn everything changed. They never stopped loving each other. Life simply carried them onto different roads." She looked toward the unopened bundle resting on the nearby pew. Those letters were returned before they ever reached her. She came to the bridge every Sunday for months, believing someone might bring them back. Eventually she grew older. People moved away. The world became busy. Only hope remained. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the silver compass resting in his jacket pocket. "Is Eleanor still alive?" he asked quietly. The woman nodded with a gentle smile. "She is 90 years old now. She lives with her granddaughter on the far side of Silver Creek, about 30 miles from here. Her memory fades some days, but one thing never changes. Every Sunday afternoon she asks whether anyone has checked the bridge." Daniel stood perfectly still. 30 miles suddenly felt much shorter than the years those letters had waited in silence. Ranger rose before another word was spoken and walked toward the chapel door. The elderly woman laughed softly. "He already knows what comes next." Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the quiet meadow while a light breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the grass. Daniel looked down at Ranger. "You have been trying to show me this all along, have you not?" The German shepherd answered only by looking toward the gravel road leading away from the chapel. Daniel smiled for the first time that day, a smile small enough that only Ranger could have noticed. They returned to the farmhouse before evening, where Daniel carefully cleaned each envelope with a soft cloth and placed the letters inside a sturdy leather satchel beside the silver compass and faded photograph. He searched through an old county map until he found Silver Creek marked beside a narrow river several counties away. As sunset painted the western sky with warm shades of orange and crimson, Daniel folded the map and placed it inside the satchel as well. Ranger lay quietly beside the front door, watching every movement with peaceful certainty. The farmhouse felt different now, not because anything inside had changed, but because tomorrow finally carried a destination. Before extinguishing the porch light, Daniel rested one hand against Ranger's broad shoulder. "We leave at sunrise," he whispered. Ranger slowly lifted his head, his amber eyes reflecting the last light of day, and gently placed one paw against the weathered leather satchel, as though reminding Daniel that some promises may sleep for decades, but they are never truly forgotten until someone chooses to carry them home. The sunrise over Silver Creek painted the distant mountains in soft shades of amber and gold as Daniel Brooks guided his aging pickup truck along a quiet country road lined with cottonwood trees already dressed in autumn colors. Ranger sat calmly in the passenger seat, his posture steady, his amber eyes watching the road ahead with the same silent confidence that had led them from the old bridge to this final destination. Neither of them seemed hurried. Some journeys were never meant to be rushed. The leather satchel rested safely between them, holding the 12 unopened letters, the silver compass, and the faded photograph that had waited patiently through decades of forgotten seasons. After nearly an hour, Daniel turned onto a gravel driveway leading to a modest white farmhouse surrounded by flower gardens that still bloomed despite the cooling weather. A wooden swing moved gently on the front porch as the morning breeze carried the comforting scent of fresh bread and lavender through the quiet yard. Ranger stepped from the truck before Daniel had fully opened his own door. Instead of running ahead, he walked slowly toward the porch, each step calm and respectful, as though he understood that some places deserved gentle footsteps. Before Daniel could knock, the front door opened. A woman in her early 50s smiled warmly. Her silver strands of hair caught the sunlight, and kindness rested naturally within her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. Daniel removed his cap. "I hope so. I came because of someone named Eleanor Harper." The woman's expression changed instantly. Surprise gave way to quiet curiosity. "She is my grandmother," she answered. "Please come in." The farmhouse carried the peaceful warmth of a home filled with memories. Family photographs covered the hallway walls, quilts rested neatly across comfortable chairs, and the scent of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Near the living room window sat an elderly woman wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Her silver hair framed a gentle face marked by time, but her eyes still held a softness untouched by the passing years. She looked toward the visitors without speaking. Ranger stopped several feet away. He lowered his head slightly before sitting quietly on the wooden floor. Eleanor watched him for a long moment. Then a faint smile slowly appeared across her face. "You remind me of another good dog," she whispered almost to herself. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He walked forward carefully and placed the weathered leather satchel onto the small table beside her chair. "These belong to you," he said. Eleanor looked at the satchel without understanding. Daniel carefully removed the faded blue ribbon and laid the 12 unopened letters before her. For several seconds the room became perfectly still. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to disappear into the silence. Eleanor reached forward with trembling hands. Her fingertips brushed the familiar handwriting on the first envelope. She closed her eyes. A single quiet breath escaped her lips before tears gathered gently beneath her lashes. "Thomas," she whispered. Not as a question. As though she had spoken the name every Sunday for the last 50 years and had never truly expected an answer. She lifted the first letter against her heart instead of opening it. Her granddaughter quietly wiped away tears of her own while Daniel stepped back without saying another word. Ranger slowly crossed the room and rested his head beside Eleanor's knee. She smiled through glistening eyes and gently placed one weathered hand upon his broad head. "You found your way," she whispered to him. "And somehow, you helped these memories find theirs too." Word traveled through the valley more quickly than Daniel Brooks ever expected, although he had never told anyone what had happened inside Eleanor Harper's farmhouse. Small towns have a quiet way of carrying hope from one front porch to another. Within days, neighbors began speaking about the elderly woman who smiled more often than she had in years. The owner of the local grocery store noticed that Eleanor no longer stared silently through the front window whenever her granddaughter brought her into town. Instead, She greeted strangers with gentle warmth and carried one carefully folded envelope inside her sweater pocket wherever she went. Every Sunday afternoon she chose a different letter, unfolded it slowly, and read it beneath the shade of an old maple tree in her garden while Ranger rested peacefully beside her whenever Daniel drove over to visit. She never hurried through the words. Each page deserved the years it had waited. Daniel usually remained on the porch with a cup of black coffee, watching autumn leaves drift across the yard while listening to Eleanor's quiet laughter carried gently by the breeze. He understood that some conversations belonged to the people who had lived them, and his place was simply to make sure they could finally happen. Before long, people began asking Daniel how he had discovered the hidden letters. He always gave the same answer. He looked toward Ranger, smiled faintly, and said, "He showed me where to look." Nothing more. The simplicity of that answer somehow satisfied everyone. Children especially loved the story. Whenever Daniel and Ranger visited town, young boys and girls knelt beside the German shepherd, scratching behind his ears while asking if he truly knew secret places. Ranger accepted every gentle hand with patient dignity, his tail moving slowly against the sidewalk as though kindness itself was the only reward he had ever wanted. The local newspaper eventually printed a small article about the remarkable delivery that had arrived decades late. There were no dramatic headlines, only a quiet photograph of Eleanor holding one unopened letter while Ranger sat faithfully beside her chair. People from neighboring counties mailed handwritten notes after reading the story. Some shared memories of family members who had served their country. Others spoke about old promises that had somehow found their way home despite the passing years. The little chapel beyond the forest also changed. Visitors began stopping there on peaceful Sunday afternoons, not because it had become famous, but because they wanted to experience the calm that seemed to surround the old building. Fresh flowers appeared more often beside the wooden cross, and someone quietly repaired the weathered bench overlooking the creek without asking for recognition. Daniel noticed the new boards one crisp October morning when he and Ranger returned to the bridge together. They stood there watching sunlight shimmer across the flowing water exactly as it had on the day everything began. Ranger walked to the center of the bridge, sat facing the distant road, and remained perfectly still. Daniel looked at him with new understanding. For years he had believed the German shepherd was waiting for someone to come home. Now he realized something much deeper. Ranger had never been waiting for a person. He had been protecting a promise that did not belong to him, faithfully guarding forgotten hope until the right heart was willing to carry it the rest of the way. Daniel rested one weathered hand gently upon Ranger's broad shoulders. Around them, the wind whispered softly through the pines, carrying the scent of cedar and fallen leaves across the quiet valley. The bridge no longer felt abandoned. It felt remembered. And for the first time in many years, the long empty road ahead no longer seemed lonely at all. 1 year later the first light of autumn returned to the valley with the same quiet grace that had welcomed countless mornings before. Mist floated gently above the open fields, and golden sunlight slowly climbed over the pine-covered hills, warming the weathered porch of Daniel Brooks's farmhouse. Some things had changed with time, while others had remained exactly as they were meant to be. Ranger still greeted every sunrise from the same familiar spot at the edge of the porch, his broad silhouette outlined against the soft morning sky. He was a little older now. A few silver hairs had begun to appear around his muzzle, and his movements had grown slightly slower, but nothing had changed the calm strength in his amber eyes. Daniel stepped outside carrying 2 steaming mugs, one filled with black coffee and the other with warm water that Ranger always seemed to enjoy on chilly mornings after returning from his quiet patrol around the property. He sat beside his faithful companion without speaking. Neither of them needed conversation to understand the peace surrounding them. The gravel road stretched toward the distant forest exactly as it always had, yet it no longer felt like a road leading toward unanswered questions. It had become a path filled with remembered kindness. Every few weeks Daniel and Ranger still visited Eleanor Harper. Her health had become more fragile, but her smile seemed brighter than ever. She had finished reading every one of Thomas's letters, though she often returned to the first one simply to hear his young voice again through words preserved by time. The silver compass now rested inside a small wooden display case beside her favorite chair, while the faded photograph had been carefully restored and framed by her granddaughter. It hung near the living room window where afternoon sunlight touched it every day. On one of those visits Eleanor had quietly placed her weathered hand over Daniel's and smiled with peaceful certainty. "Those letters reached me exactly when they were supposed to," she had whispered. "Not when they were written. When our hearts were finally ready to receive them." Daniel had carried those words home like another precious letter. That morning he reached into his jacket pocket and gently touched his marine dog tags before looking toward Ranger. The German shepherd suddenly lifted his head, not because he sensed mystery this time, but because familiar laughter drifted down the road. A small pickup truck rolled slowly into the driveway. Eleanor's granddaughter climbed out carrying a woven basket covered with a red cloth. Behind her, two neighborhood children hurried toward the porch with bright smiles and homemade dog treats wrapped in colorful paper. Ranger stood to greet them with the same quiet dignity he offered everyone. The younger child gently hugged his neck before placing a hand-painted wooden sign beside the front steps. Across its smooth surface were simple words burned carefully into the wood. "Faithful friend. Silent keeper." Daniel smiled softly, feeling that no greater honor could have been given. As everyone shared fresh bread, warm cider, and quiet conversation beneath the clear autumn sky, a gentle breeze stirred the wind chime beside the front door. Its familiar melody drifted across the valley before disappearing into the peaceful morning air. Ranger returned to his favorite place at the edge of the porch and looked once more toward the winding country road. This time Daniel understood exactly what his old friend was watching. Not someone who had been lost. Not someone who might arrive. He was simply protecting the quiet hope that every promise made with love will someday find its way home, even if the journey takes longer than anyone could ever imagine. Daniel rested one weathered hand upon Ranger's shoulder, and together they watched the sunlight spread across the valley in perfect silence, knowing that some stories do not end with applause or celebration. They end with grace, carried gently forward by loyal hearts that never stop believing.